Hi, I'm Zeb. I'm from Darling Dork, and today I'm going to be reviewing a copy of 1989, The Dawn of Freedom. Now, for those of you who haven't played it, 1989 is basically the sister game of Twilight Struggle. It's made by GMT Games. It's functionally identical. It has some minor rule differences, but if you played Twilight Struggle, you can jump into this game very quickly. And if you haven't, well, that's kind of what I'm here for. I'll walk through the basics of the game. So, the premise is, it's 1989, Eastern European governments are crumbling, communism is on the way out. One side, one player, is taking on the role of the democratic activists. They're trying to initiate democratic change, bring down these dictatorial governments. The other side is playing as the communists, who are desperately trying to stay in power by any means necessary. So they use a combination of repression but openness to try to keep their populations under control for as long as possible. Your goal as the communist is to stay in power in as many different countries for as long as possible as pressure mounts against you, while your goal as the Democrat is to bring as many of these countries into democracy as quickly as possible. What do you get with this game? The game board has all sorts of things on it. It has 6 countries you're focusing on: East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. It has the victory points track, a legend for all the different spaces, turn marker. The big thing that comes with the game are the action cards. Now, like in Twilight Struggle, these are cards that are based on real-life events that you can use for one of two things, either to conduct operations or for the event's value. There are 2 kinds of operations you carry out in this game. Unlike in Twilight Struggle, where there are 3, you just have the 2. So one is to place influence in a territory that is adjacent to your own. So we'll say I'm the Democrat. I'm in Gdansk. I want to put influence into, here's where my Polish starts to sound really bad, Poznan. The card has a printed number value on it. Here it's 3. So if I use this for influence, I get to spend 3 influence points however I like. So I can put 3 into Poznan. The other thing you can do are realignment rolls. So we'll say that the Soviets have enough influence in Lublin to have gained control over it. Using die rolls, depending on how many neighboring areas I control, I can attempt to realign it, much like a realignment roll in Twilight Struggle. We add up our respective modifiers, we both roll. Depending on how I do, he can lose influence, and if I do really well, I can actually gain influence back. This is a slight tweak from Twilight Struggle. These little numbered icons, as shown here, reflect how much influence, power, and control you have over a given region in the game. Now, when they're printed with the color in bold on the front, that means you control the area. So if I put it up like this, the area is red, I control Lublin. If it's other side up like this, I have influence there, but it's not under my control yet. You'll notice that there are different regions throughout the board, and they have different little symbols. So Bialystok has a sickle. That means it's controlled by farmers. It's a farming space. Lodz has a hammer. It's a space for workers. The typewriter signifies intellectuals. There are several throughout the game. They basically represent the different constituencies of the country. So another important area, the victory points track. It runs to 20 on the Democrat side and negative 20 on the communist side. If either side reaches their respective mark, they've won the game instantly. Over here, you have the Tiananmen Square track. This represents events that are going on in China at the same time, as protesters there are working towards democracy. I'll get to the functional gameplay effect for that as well. And then we have the struggle for power tableau, which, again, I'll get to momentarily. So the game is mostly played through these action cards. The action cards have the operations you can do, but then there are also the events that go off from them. There are 3 different decks of action cards. You have the early year cards, the middle year cards, and the late year cards. Broadly speaking, there's 2 different types of events in terms of how they get shuffled into the deck. Events without an asterisk get played over and over again. You can use them repeatedly. Events with an asterisk, such as Goodbye Lenin here, if you play it for its event, it is discarded from play. It doesn't come back into the game again. So it only gets used once if you're using it for the event. If you're just using it for operations, you can use it multiple times. You'll notice that some of them have a little red star. That means the event that's on it is associated with the communist player. If the Democrat plays it, the communist event gets to go off. So you don't want to play your opponent's cards. You're going to have to eventually, it's just part of the game, but it's not going to be good for you when it happens. Then there are some that are neutral. They don't have a color in either, they're just neutral cards. Either side can play them at no ill effect to themselves. Within the decks, there are scoring cards. Much like Twilight Struggle, you have basically battleground spaces and non-battleground spaces. And the battleground spaces have these little colored bars on them. So here's my Hungarian is really bad. Debrecen. Debrecen is a battleground space. When scoring comes up, which I will find momentarily, here we go. Hungary scoring. When this card gets played, a struggle for power begins. Each side gets a number of cards depending on the spaces they control in an area. So let's say that I'm the Democrat, I control Budapest, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce that one. And then the communist player controls another space I can't pronounce, and yet another space I can't pronounce. Each of us gets 8 cards to go into a struggle for power. What's a struggle for power? Well, I'll show you that. They're dealt these different kinds of tactic cards. So you have petition, march, strike, and rally in the square. You also have leader cards. So leader cards function like wild cards. So for example, student leader. If I controlled the university, which is this, again, another space whose name I can't pronounce, but it's a university, I can use the student leader as a wild card. It matches any other suit. And what you're doing, you're playing matched cards against matched cards. So let's say the communist went first and he plays strike. The Democrat would have to respond with strike or a wild card or a couple of other tactics cards, or he loses the struggle. Then whoever wins the struggle, once it's over, both sides roll dice. That reflects how much support the communist may lose in the country, how many victory points the Democrat might gain, and whether or not the communist can stay in power. Now, that might sound like it's pretty stacked against the communists, especially since we know how history goes. Well, they lose pretty uniformly in Eastern Europe. But the communist player is also getting points for every time he manages to hang on to power. So even though you might lose a struggle for power in Hungary, unless the Democrat rolls well enough, you're not going to be kicked out. Your control might be threatened, and you're getting points for every time you just successfully stay in power, and that multiplies. So if by some miracle I was challenged 4 times in Hungary and hung on to power every time, I'd be getting multiples of those victories over and over and over again. Over here, the Tiananmen Square track. It functions like the space race in Twilight Struggle. I'm sorry to keep drawing that analogy, but it's just too easy. It kind of writes itself. For those of you who don't know, I'd mentioned those action cards that are bad for you. So if I'm the communist and Goodbye Lenin comes up, a reference to a great movie, I may not want to play Goodbye Lenin. Instead, I can discard that card to roll on the Tiananmen Square track. So I add the value of the card, 3, roll the die, 4, well, not good enough to move along the track, but at least the card's not in my hand. I don't have to worry about it going off or something. As you get farther and farther along, you get victory point bonuses. You also get certain bonuses you can play in the game. So for example, if you made it to the end, and the end track is different for either side. If you're a Democrat, political pluralism reigns in China, and if you're not, if you're the communist, communist China receives most favored nation status. If you make it to the end, you can play a card for both ops and events once per turn. So you could take Prudence, for example. You get the 4 operations points and the event from it. Pretty crippling if you can bring that into play against your opponent. However, you can only keep those powers if you're ahead of them on the track. So if you manage to get all the way through all 10 turns of the game without having automatically won on one side or the other, then you do a final scoring round. You go through each and every country that remains, regardless of whether or not the communists are still in power, and you score them. This is important because it's possible to have a country lose its communist ruler, but the communists can continue to put influence into it. It's important for scoring purposes. It also lets you recoup if you had a bad power struggle and accidentally lost a country. That happened to me in East Germany one game, actually. So you go through all the points, you modify it here, and then when it's all said and done, the communists get 4 points for every country they have where they're still in power. I've never seen a game where they had more than 3. Things would really have to go belly up for the Democrats on that one, but it's theoretically possible. So that's basically gameplay in a nutshell. You're trying to win control of these regions, stay in control, And it gets progressively harder for the communists as time goes on. How does it stack up in the history? It does actually a pretty compelling job. So this might go over some people's heads, but Hungary, for example, is one of the early game scoring cards. That's because in 1989, Hungary was one of the first countries to open up to the West, which then, because refugees could come through Hungary into the West, put pressure on East Germany, which eventually leads to the fall of the Berlin Wall. The game is built really cleverly that way. It actually does a great job of capturing history and the way things played out, while leaving some room for how things could have played out. It's not inconceivable that communism could have survived in some altered form in one of these countries. So it lets you experiment a bit with the history. It works, I'd say, fairly well that way. In terms of gameplay, it's a little bit more luck-based than Twilight Struggle, but sometimes that can be a good thing. Twilight Struggle can be very deterministic in how it plays out. And if the cards really aren't working out for you that game, and then somebody plays a scoring card in a region, there might not be much you can do to get it back. Things will just stack up against you. The power struggle mechanic, because the cards are coming to you randomly, even if you're dealt fewer cards than your opponent, if you play them correctly, you could still win a power struggle. It's a little bit more luck-based, but it doesn't punish people who've also gotten just bad event cards the entire game. So it's a game for a slightly different mood than Twilight Struggle. It's a little bit just infinitesimally more luck-based, but it rewards tactics also, as opposed to strategy. I think they're both really fun. If I had to give this game a number, I would probably mark it on probably around a 9. I'm pretty game to play it whenever at this point. And if you're a real history geek, which you might have figured out that I am at this point, it's really fun to go play. The rulebook comes with a manual explaining every single one of the events in the game. So you have an event like Sinatra Doctrine. You might wonder what the Sinatra Doctrine is. The book will explain it to you. And the explanation is pretty hilarious if you're considering the source. So I encourage you to go out and play this game. Thank you.